Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning, joined this morning by my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman. Good morning, Marc.
Good morning, Eddie.
I hope life in South Florida is treating you very, very, very well. It's raining.
Better than I deserve, better than I deserve.
Absolutely. So this morning we are coming to the end of the Joseph cycle in the Torah. The story of Vayigash, this week's Torah portion, begins with the great reconciliation among the brothers. All of the tension in the brothers' stories is now resolved, and the brothers come together. And there is a remarkable scene that's often overlooked in this Torah portion, that when Joseph brings his father Jacob down from Canaan, down into Egypt, where he'll live a life of comfort and joy, the Torah says in the 47th chapter, Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh. So you bring the father to meet the boss, right?
Right.
And Jacob greeted Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asks Jacob, this is 47:8, how many are the years of your life? Kama yemei shenei chayecha. So he asks him, old man, how old are you? But Jacob understands a different question. He hears a different question. He answers a different question, right? Vayomer Yaakov el Pharaoh. He answered the Pharaoh, Yemei shenei migurai shloshim u'at shana. The years of my sojourn on earth are 130 years. Ma'at v'ra'im hayu yemei shanai. Few and miserable have been the years of my life, nor do they come to the lifespan of my fathers during their sojourn. Pharaoh says, old man, it's so good to meet you. Your son has been so useful to me and so helpful to me. Tell me how old you are. And Jacob gives him a sermon about how miserable his life has been and how he doesn't feel like his accomplishments add up to the accomplishments of his father or his grandfather, his sainted ancestors. And then they separate. Jacob bid Pharaoh farewell and he left. That moment.
Yeah.
And it's because I'm getting old and my beard is gray, my hair is gray. That moment, and here's the reason why that moment strikes me, Marc.
Yeah.
When I was a little kid, my grandmother used to come, my grandmother used to come and stay with us when my parents would take a little trip. And my grandmother was this little European lady who baked us cookies. And I once calculated out her age and realized that when she was a little European lady, she was 55 years old. See, so there was a time just a generation ago when people lived to be 65 years old. That's why Medicare and Social Security were set at 65, because they didn't expect you to live much longer than that.
Right.
And then came a whole set of drugs after the Second World War, and the lifespan was expanded to 72. Now, it doesn't mean that every part of life expands. It means we add a sort of moment of life. And the moment we added after World War II was teenage. We invented teenagers. Adolescence became a time of life. Eric Erikson publishes this famous essays on the 8 ages of man. And he says that in your adolescence, you have an identity crisis. And as soon as he publishes the paper, every Harvard undergraduate who studied with him ran home to tell her mother that we're having an identity crisis and we don't understand each other. And the Beatles came and James Dean movies came, and we defined teenage as a time of life. Well, what's happened, it seems to me, is that we have expanded the lifespan again. And now people don't die at 65. They don't even die, thank God, at 70, 72. They live into their 80s, even to their 90s. You know, my dad is 94 and he's still watching us this morning. Thank God, you know. Now, the remarkable thing is we've added 2 new times of life. One is called early adulthood, between 22 and 32. It's the time when kids go look for themselves. But the one that I'm really interested in today is late adulthood. A period of time from the end of your working years in your 60s or your 70s until you become too feeble to do very much. In my community, there's a huge population of very active, intelligent, wise people who are in those later years. But here's the problem. We haven't figured out yet what gives that time of life meaning. What gives it purpose? how we should structure that time of life, because the culture is so youth oriented. Everything that is new is better than anything that is old. I mean, you've never seen a product on television advertised to make you look older in only minutes a day, right? Because old is defined as worn out, retired because you're tired. Old is there's not much left energy. There's no energy there. New is improved and young and vital and filled with life. Of course, the biblical tradition, it has it differently. In the biblical tradition, because we're not defined by our bodies, old age brings wisdom and it brings depth. But we haven't figured that out in our culture yet. And
Lifnei seva tekum.
yes,
Rise before the face of the aged.
And there's all these words in the tradition for that aging, seva, zikna. There's words for this time of life. So the question is, what do we do to help people in their older ages not come to the kind of bitterness that Father Jacob reflects? My years have been few and ra'im and evil and bad. How do you help people find integrity? How do you help them find meaning? How do you help them find purpose as they reach the older ages, the older years, the later years of their life? Now, I understand that you had an anniversary this year, an important anniversary in your life.
I have. I've been blessed to celebrate this year. It'll be in June of 2022. It'll be my Jubilee year as a rabbi, my 50th year doing this work. 50 years.
So what has 50 years of the rabbinate taught you? And how do you look back at a whole career in 50 years and say, here's what's worthwhile holding on to?
Well, it's interesting because all of my classmates got together and we're all putting down little 2-minute vignettes about what we've learned in 50 years. And we're going to make a kind of montage, which people will watch, mainly to see which of us are dead and which of us are made it through 50 years of the rabbinate. But I had a chance to think about it. And at first it made me kind of crazy because I don't like banal summaries. I don't like trite little summaries of an entire life. I don't think you can do that. I think it comes from the work you and I do and have done of eulogies. You say, what are you supposed to do about a guy's whole life in a couple of minutes here on a eulogy? So, but I put down some thoughts and it was helpful to me to do it. And what I came up with was that some things in the 50 years of my work have dramatically changed. And some things have stayed the same. And if it weren't for the change, and if it weren't for the sameness, I wouldn't have had the joy that I did have in being a rabbi for so long. So what's changed, I can best tell you by telling you a little story. It was when I retired from the synagogue 8 years ago, and at that time, my assistant rabbi, who's now the senior rabbi, was Susie Moskowitz. My educator was Rachel Wiesenberg, and my cantor was Serene Applebaum. So I'm in a Ask the Rabbi session, my last one of my career, with a group of little kids from the school, and a cute little girl stands up and asks me, "Can a man become a rabbi?" Because like, all she ever saw in Temple Beth Torah were women rabbis. And 50 years ago, I was ordained with Sally Priesand, the very first woman rabbi. And you are lucky and blessed to be married to the number 2 rabbi. And Nina was number 2, which happened because of birth. She might have been number 1. But so that has dramatically changed the face of the rabbinate. And it's such a blessing that my Jubilee year coincides with Sally Priesand's. But things also have not changed at all. And the first one, and the most basic one, is that if you don't have a deep belief in God, you can't do this work. You just can't. I remember one of our God Squad shows with Tom Hartman. We were interviewing rabbinical students from HUC, and Tommy asked them, "Do you believe in God? Tell me about your belief in God." And I thought at first it was an odd question because he's talking to rabbinical students, for God's sake, for God's sake. And they answered almost to a person that they had doubts about God's existence. And this totally freaked out Tommy. But they said, no, we have doubts, and we express those doubts. And frankly, they were very, very upfront about their agnosticism. And they said, we think it'll be good for us to be in a congregation where we can express our doubts and share our doubts with congregants who also have doubts. And, Tommy just couldn't figure it out, and I couldn't either, but I tried to help him understand. There's all these different ideas of what the rabbinate is. I mean, there's the humanist rabbinate, which doesn't have God in it, and which Mordecai Kaplan was sort of responsible for. And the social worker rabbinate, where people think being a rabbi is just like being a social worker, and you enter people's lives, whatever that means. And the positive psychology rabbinate, which is very big now, of just sort of psychobabble teachings about happiness and centeredness, and I don't even know. And then there's the secular Jewish peoplehood rabbinate, sort of a kind of Zionism without Zionism. And none of those versions of the rabbinate ever appealed to me. I always believed, Eddie, that the only reason to sacrifice what we have had to sacrifice is the sure belief that with God we are never alone, we're never betrayed, and we are never abandoned. For me, every morning I pray Adonai Tzuri v'Goali, that God is my rock and my salvation. And this has not changed. And that has given me joy and strength every day of my rabbinate. And then, of course, and you and I have gone around and around on this, and I also have to credit Tommy with sort of not teaching me, but reminding me that Jews believe in heaven, that Jews believe in Olam Haba, but that the undeniable fact is that Christians are taught more about heaven than Jews are taught about the world to come. That's just the truth. And the belief that we will not be separated forever from those we love is the only hope that can survive the grave, Eddie. It's the only response to human finitude that gives us strength to face our death and the death of those we love. The end of our journey here is not the end of our journey. That has not changed in my soul. That has not changed. And I believe that hope is the one hope that people need from their rabbis. And also my work on the God Squad with Tommy over 50 years, I can't ignore that. There's a big step in what used to be called interfaith dialogue. What Tommy and I did, no one ever did. Actually, it should be called spiritual friendship. We always tried to share with our audiences and on our show and our HBO special, Peabody winning HBO, How Do You Spell God? Little plug there for a show that you can't even see anymore. We tried to stress a single missionary belief, sort of. And that belief was that we know enough about how we're different and not enough about how we're all the same. It just seemed obvious to both of us that God did not give all the truth to just one faith. I believe that with all my heart, Ed. Tzadikei umot ha'olam yesh lehem chelek be'olam haba. The righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. That is our teaching, and I believe it is a true teaching. Circling the wagons, which is a form of the rabbinate that many rabbis choose, meaning sort of defending Jews against anything that they think is not Jewish. I don't think that's a healthy spiritual response. to a world of many paths. And this has not changed. And finally, the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart taught my favorite single teaching of any spiritual master. His teaching was this: if your only prayer is thank you, it will be enough. So to God and to my dear colleagues, and to you, my dear friend, I simply pray this prayer. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would only let me. I don't want to push back because
No,
I don't want
no,
to
go
disagree.
ahead.
But see, I think I agree with you to this extent. The Rambam, when you read Maimonides, it's very clear that for Maimonides, Jewish is not an identity. It's not a
No.
group you belong to. It's
No.
not. It's not even primarily a lifestyle. Jewish is a truth. And for the Rambam, the question is, what is the truth of my faith? What is the truth that I'm trying to teach my family? What is the truth that I'm trying to share with the community? The lifestyle of the Jewish people, the holidays, the customs, the rituals, the cultural affectations are all clothing that clothe and protect and promulgate a truth, a deep inner core of truth.
Amen.
The problem is that post-Holocaust Judaism has lost that sense of truth, except for the very Orthodox among us. The Orthodox community, I think, does have a very powerful sense of truth. Unfortunately, I think it violates one of your other teachings because they're so worried about defending it from the outside, and it comes with a certain amount of fear that they're unwilling to understand that that truth could be shared by multiple communities of human beings and still be deeply valuable to us.
Yeah, and deeply Jewish.
Yeah, deeply Jewish and deeply unique. That a truth can be expressed in Jewish language, even though it might be a universal truth. Yeah. That becomes a bit of a problem with that community, although we're not here to criticize anybody.
So we're in agreement. What's the problem?
No. But I think that, but here's the question. The question is that for the rest of us, for those of us who have grown up in post-Holocaust Judaism, the surety, the certainty that the Rambam brings to his faith in God, the deep faith that your friend Tommy had in his church, the deep faith that you promulgate, is difficult for many of us because the world has made it so very difficult to hold on to those truths.
That is absolutely right. And we live in a secular world. Yeah. But there are, if you look at your life, Ed, honestly, the truth is that everything that is wonderful about you is countercultural. I mean, you're kind in a world that is cruel. You're open in a world that is closed. You're welcoming in a world that is terrifying. Everything about you is different than the world as a whole. It used to be, and I mean, when I say used to be, back in the 50s, when we were kids in the 60s, it used to be that we were in a culture that was basically religious. It had certain problems, though. It constricted unnaturally and unfairly the horizons of women and of gay people and of other people, minorities, who, when you look at the old TV shows or the old movies, you can see just how misrepresented the world was.
They're embarrassing to look at them now, actually.
Yeah, it was. It was. But the point is that there was something about that world that was brilliant and beautiful and sustaining and hopeful and joyous.
Yeah.
And that was that we all had shared beliefs. This was our religion, and there were other religions, and Milton Steinberg and Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, and you know, the triumph of America after World War II, and you know, the American century and the greatest generation. There was so much to be proud of in the culture. My consciousness and yours, you know, began in the Vietnam War and proceeded through the civil rights movement and all sorts of other social struggles. And so it's not surprising that people who believe in God are beleaguered. But for me, I have an almost Calvinist belief that we haven't spoken of very often about faith. Ed, I believe Calvin was right, John Calvin, that you're born with this, you're chosen to have it, and that if you have faith, there's nothing you can do to get rid of it. You're just a believer naturally, and if you don't have it, there's really not much you can do to get it. So I would spend my time with people who thought they were agnostics or atheists. I would spend my time convincing them that they weren't really atheists, but that they had been just talked into it by circumstance or by influential thinkers. And I was pretty successful at it because, I talked to people who were angry at God, and I would do the Hasidic thing. Are you really that angry at God? Yes, I'm really that angry. God didn't. Well, if you're that angry, it means you believe, because you can't be angry at something that doesn't exist. And so I would do that kind of thing. But basically, I believe that there are spiritually tuned in people and people who are not spiritually sensitive. And that's just sort of the way they are. I don't have a big desire to change them from the way they are. I'm happy to teach those who want to open themselves to faith. But I'm not really that anxious to, I certainly don't judge them, and I'm not interested in trying to convert them. My work is with people who believe. And how can that belief get deeper and more sustaining?
I would just turn that just a little bit differently, not to disagree with your beautiful last point, your quotation from Meister Eckhart, that the greatest prayer is thank you. But I would add just a different tone on it. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that the greatest element of Jewishness, of Jewish, is hope.
Yes.
I think that all of Judaism, that Jewish culture, the Jewish religious imagination exists to sustain hope. And the whole apparatus of Jewish life is an answer to the question of what sort of universe would I have to live in order for my hope to make some sense? That's really the great question. Because if I take the simple materialist universe that the secular culture teaches, it's a pretty despairing vision of life.
Yes.
Right? It takes something bigger in order to say, I exist for a purpose. My life has a purpose. My life has a meaning, and that there's hope for me and for the world. Yeah. The difference between kids raised now and the way you and I were raised, even though we were raised in a world, and they don't remember this, by the way, something called the Cold War. We used to have what we called drop drills under our desk, because we lived in a neighborhood I happened to live in a neighborhood where there was a lot of defense industries. And we were sure that when the Russians came, they were going to bomb Canoga Park, and the teacher would scream out the word drop, and you would get down under your desk, because your half-inch Formica desk was going to protect you from millions of Russian megatons of death.
That is hysterical, Eddie.
But besides that, even though that was the case, we still believed in an expanding universe of possibilities.
Yes.
Still believed that we had efficacy. We could change the world. Even the crazy fantasies of my boomer generation, we believed that we could change the world. We believed that we could improve the world. We believed that we could improve the human being. Yes. This was the great faith of my generation. Now, a lot of that became disillusioned in the course of time. It's one of the reasons I became a rabbi, is because I looked for a better way to hold on to that faith. Kids today don't believe that. No. I don't think that they believe that they can live in a world of opening possibilities. I think that their world is a lot more constricted, and that worries me a lot. And that brings us back to the question we started with. So when someone reaches old age now, and they have years still, how do you find a sense of hope even in that circumstance? How do you find a sense of purpose even in that circumstance? Now, what you've described in terms of faith, I think is a very important part of this. How else do you find that?
Well, there's a technique that I developed by watching a guy who worked in our house and who was spackling walls. He was carrying some spackle compound up the stairs, and he was carrying 2 big 5-gallon jugs of it. And I said to him, why are you carrying 2? You don't need 2 cans. 1 will be enough. He said, yes, I know, but if I only carry 1, it'll pull me off to one side and hurt my back. By carrying 2, I can carry both the buckets, and I'm balanced, and I can carry them both up the stairs. And it's funny that this worker changed my life, because I realized that's it, spiritual balancing. And I realized when people would come to me because they were in grief, it wasn't that they had no reason for grief. They had lots of reasons for grief, or when they lost their job, or when something bad happened. There were lots of reasons to be sad, or to be anxious, or to be despairing. And so what I did is I developed this technique for counseling called spiritual balancing. I would go for 5 minutes where I would say, I only want you to tell me what's bad in your life for 5 minutes. And I don't want anything good, just what's bad, 5 minutes, and make it as bad as you can make it. Then 5 minutes would be over. I'd say, stop. Okay, now for 5 minutes, the next 5 minutes, I want you to tell me all the things that are still good in your life, things that you're still happy that you have and feel blessed that you have. Think carefully, and only good things for 5 minutes. So they would do that. And Eddie, every single time after the next 5 minutes, I'd say, how do you feel? And they would say one version or another of, I feel balanced now. I feel balanced. So the point is, when you get older, you tend to kvetch more. But what you do is you build into your life moments of spiritual balancing. If you're listening, folks, you can do this. Start out with 1 minute, like these exercise guys. Whatever it is that you can do, 2 minutes, 1 minute of kvetch about what's bad, and then the same amount of time, use a watch, make sure it's the same time, of what's good in your life. The thank you, the Meister Eckhart thank you stuff. And you will notice that what's happened to you is not that things are impossibly bad, but that you're spending way too much time thinking about what's impossibly bad and not enough time thinking about what is still good.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful exercise.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful.
I've taught it to psychiatrists.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, spiritual balancing.
That's very brilliant.
Thank
I'll
you.
just let me just add one more exercise to it.
Yeah, please.
This was taught to me by my Tante Sarah. My bubby was one of 5, and her older sister, Tante Sarah, even though they all came to America at the same time, never quite learned English, right? She was a lady who was about 5 foot 4.
Yeah, they were all 5 feet tall.
And 5'4" wide.
Yeah, they were round. Eddie, they were round.
They and Tante Sarah would take 2-3 buses a day. I said to Tante Sarah, what were you doing today? She says, I went to the old age home and I sat with the guy and I told stories so he could read. He can't see I'm reading to him. So first I said, Tante Sarah, how old is that man? He's very old, 82 years old. I said, Tante Sarah, you're 88. He says, yeah, but he's old. And then, I mean, and so I'm thinking like, so here's my heavily accented Tante Sarah going off to read English books to some poor guy. But she could never let go of the opportunity to help somebody. If she had a chance to help, it was worth taking 2-3 buses a day to go to some godforsaken old age home and sit with a guy who was actually younger than her, because it gave her a sense of purpose. It gave her a sense of efficacy, of power in the world. And she was doing something to lift somebody else's spirits. I believe in that. I really do. And I think part of the problem is this notion of retiring. right? Retiring is not what we want to do. You're tired, I get it. It means you got to do something else. You need to retread, is not retire, is what you need to do. And find a different place to devote your energies and a different place to invest yourself, because every one of us has to feel like we're doing something in the world. Doing something. Someone showed me that if you take the word resignation, right? Resign is what it means. Resign, sign up for something different. You got to keep learning. You got to keep growing. You got to keep adding to the world. You got to keep teaching. You got to keep adding something. And I think that changes the whole orientation to old age. And I think that's what's missing. The sad story of Father Jacob is that when he looks back at his life, he looks at all the things that were done to him. You know, the struggle with his brother, the struggle between the wives, the struggle with the children, the loss of the child, right? The loss of his beloved wife, Rachel, the loss of Joseph for so many years. Now the family's put back together, and all he can say is, my years have been few and miserable. And that's a terrifying, to me, that's a terrifying vision of what it means to grow old. I so much prefer, there's so many other visions of what it is in the 92nd Psalm, which we say on Friday night, we'll say this morning in Shul. It's the Mizmor Shir Le'Yom Shabbat. You get to the end where it says, Tzadik hatamar yifrach. A tzaddik is a person who's always growing, who's always filled with life. And the last line is, Shalov latabo, lagid ke'ashar Adonai v'lo, that you can say on your last day in the world, it's been good. It's tov, it's been good. Yeah. And you're not the bitterness. I think has to become a communal campaign. I love your technique of balancing. I think we have to teach this. Yeah. And I love the idea of sitting down and doing what you did, which is figure out the 5 things that you have deep commitment to, deep faith in, that motivate the years of your life, and teach these things. And let's engage in a communal campaign to help people reach old age with joy and with satisfaction, instead of with the kind of anger and resignation and bitterness that seems to be so prevalent in the culture.
Amen, brother.
Sermon for this morning.
Amen.
No, it's very important. It's very important. You live in South Florida. It's the world capital of
yes, it is.
People trying to figure out what life is now that they've reached the age when they can live in South Florida.
It's true.
Let's convene next week and see how this story ends, how Father Jacob gathers up his children, right? This coming week, of course, this Shabbos this morning and this coming week, it's this strange moment in the course of the American calendar when everyone's getting ready for the Christmas and New Year's holidays. And so we want to wish everyone a really nice season. We're done with our holidays, but the music fills the air. So let me ask you a really embarrassing question for a rabbi.
Yeah, I love Christmas.
What's your favorite Christmas song? That's what I want to know.
Oh, man, I love them all. Mostly I love the ones that were written by Jews.
They're all written by Jews.
They were all written by Jews. Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire.
And Johnny Mathis.
Yeah, which was Mel Torme's.
Mel Torme wrote it, and Johnny
wrote it, yeah. And I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. I like that. I think Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer still has some deep existential meaning for me.
There you go. There you go.
And I'm really glad that Hanukkah and Christmas are a month apart. I hate it when they're on top of each other, because then the competition, which of course has beefed up Hanukkah beyond what it should be, which I think is zero, what it should be. The separation is good, because this way Christmas, which has elements in it that are obviously deep in the Christian faith, the birth of Jesus and all that, but it also has elements that are like, American Thanksgiving. It's a national holiday, and it has certain, elements that are really, really charming. And when you live in the Midwest and you had an opportunity for snow, it kind of is magical in that way. And So I always liked it, and it was very special for Tommy as well. And I think of him and I miss him deeply. But you know, I think this issue of hope is the one that comes out of that season. And if you observe Hanukkah in the right way, it's also the message of Hanukkah. And now we have a bunch of months where we have no holidays, and we go for a long stretch until the springtime comes, and we get drunk at Purim, and that's pretty much the way it's going to go for us. But we'll be here teaching you that
Amen.
next Shabbos there's always something new to learn,
Right.
and I'm just happy to be able to teach it with you, Ed.
Thanks, Mark. You too. I like, you know what I like to do this year? And this is going to sound very perverse for a rabbi, but I've fallen in love with Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol,
Oh yeah,
which you can download on Kindle for free, by the way.
really?
And in the original, not
Those-
just, there's a number of movies out that have done it, but if you just reading the original, first of all, it's a beautiful piece of literature.
Yes, it is.
And this story, it's apropos of our conversation. I mean, here is a man facing the end of his life, and he has this apparition of his partner who's gone before him, chained and bound, by the sins and mistakes of his life.
Mhm.
And in one evening, and it happens to be Christmas, although I think it's a fundamentally Jewish story because it's about tshuva. He visits his past, he sees the present, and he feels called by the present, and he confronts the inevitability of death and the question of what the future is going to be. And it changes his character, and it turns him from a bitter, angry old man into a man filled with hope and filled with charity and filled with love. And I think that's a great story. And if, and Reb Chaim Dickens, who wrote it for us,
Yeah.
I'm sure he meant it for Yom Kippur, but it had
I'm
a
sure
bigger
it did.
audience for Christmas, so he needed to sell it and support his family. But it is a beautiful story about how you do find joy in the later years of life and purpose and charity and love. And I think it's worth, your rabbi is telling you that it's worth it.
Even if its central message is profoundly wrong, which is
I
that
don't,
people can change and become tzaddikim even though they were
bah
in
humbug,
Russia their whole life.
bah humbug,
humbug.
Gellman, bah
Yeah.
humbug.
A guy who's a jerk is going to remain a jerk. A guy
No. As he says, he learns how to live in the past, present, and future all at the same time.
okay, all
And that
right.
turns him into a mensch.
Can you hear that song?
And that's the difference. Let me wish everybody a good Shabbos
Yeah.
and a wonderful week. We'll talk to you next week. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Service
shalom, my
follows at
friend.
10 o'clock here at Valley.
Ho, ho, ho.
And a wonderful week to everybody.